that I tell everybody that this is being recorded. And as everybody knows, one of the things I tend to do is I forget it. So I have a little note here to myself, I must record it. So without any ado, let me turn it over to Sam Logan, who is going to do our presentation, I think, on one of the more interesting topics in our world today. Even if we just talk about the cooling and use it, I'm just always shocked at how much energy it takes to do something. So Sam, I'll turn it over to you to do this presentation.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. And my screen is good from our...
Yep,
okay.
It is good. Yes.
Okay, well, thanks everyone. I will hopefully, I haven't timed this out perfectly today, so I'm going to make sure to leave plenty of time for discussion, hopefully. Yeah, so this article is something that just came out in JMLD. It was my first letter to the editor that I put together. And it's about generative AI and just being aware of the ethical concerns about ChatGPT and publishing research. We'll kind of talk a little bit more broadly about AI, but that's the very core central issue is about this use of ChatGPT in publishing research. Okay, so to jump in, what is AI? So this is probably something that everyone, at least I know I am tired of hearing about in some way, shape, or form. I think some things that have always existed have now been rebranded as AI. And so I think it's important just this broad idea about what it is. It's really this broad field. It's been around for decades. It includes computer science, machine and deep learning, really about using large data sets to solve complex problems. And so this is something that you would recognize in many different ways, from your Pandora radio station. As far as I understand it, that feels like a version of AI where they're predicting sort of what you might like next based on your past listening habits and using an algorithm to do that and learning it better. But there is a good distinction to make here in that there's sort of predictive AI, like what I just described, or there's generative AI. And predictive AI, it could also be, the use of health indicators, really large data sets to try to predict different health conditions like diabetes, to understand patterns and predict outcomes. So there's many valuable uses of all kinds of different versions of what AI actually is. So that is very different than this relatively, I think, newer idea about AI, and where it's actually generative. And so this is where you actually plug something into an AI software program and it generates something for you. We'll focus the first part today specifically on ChatGPT. I'll go into a couple other AI uses that are generative because they all sort of work in the same way. Where in terms of ChatGPT, it's what's known as a large language model. And essentially what it does is it uses large amounts of text data that gets input into its model. And then it has the ability to recognize underlying patterns and relationships of language. And so it's really dependent upon sort of the data that is put into its model to inform the output that it produces based on what you as a user input to it. So information used to generate new text is often based on entering a prompt. So you might type into ChatGPT, tell me about the relationship between fundamental motor skills and physical activity, and it'll then give you output that answers that question to the best of its ability. So one thing that's important, I think, to keep in mind is that it is based on probabilistic models. So it's not actually intelligent at all in many ways. It has taken all this data, you enter a prompt, and then it scans its data and tries to give you an output that it thinks you want based on everything else that's been inputted into it. So it's really a probabilistic model that you enter something into it, it uses what it has, and it generates output based on what it thinks you want from everything it has in its own database, right? So it's not actually thinking, it's not actually aware or anything. So I think that's an important distinction to make, just because I think I just as a, context here, this idea, I'm not specifically worried about AI taking over sort of anything or the robots coming to get us or anything like that. I think that sort of doomerism it's interesting to think about. It's a valid way to think about things, but just want to put out there that's really not the issue that is of major concern really with what we'll talk about today. So ChatGPT specifically, it's the most popular LLM, large language model. It gained 100 million users within the first 2 months after launch in November of 2022. And it can produce reports, summarize text, and draft content. And so how do they work? So really what ChatGPT does is the company OpenAI has developed a way to essentially try to mine and scrape every piece of text data it can possibly find on the internet. And it takes everything it can get its hands on and enter it into its models. And so it has billions and billions of text data that it has used to inform its model to produce output based on prompts entered. So why is that important to know just at least a little bit about how they work is because they scrape text data from the internet without any often consent or knowledge from anyone who actually produced that text to inform their model. So essentially, they're just taking whatever they can get their hands on in terms of taking the text and putting it into their model. And they don't necessarily have permission to do so, haven't been granted access to it for that specific use or anything like that. And so just sort of setting the stage about how they've gotten all of this information that trains their models along the way. Just a couple of headlines. I mean, even preparing for this talk in the last week and a half, 2 weeks, it's nearly impossible to keep up with everything. As every day something is seemingly coming out. But just as a broad level, there were two that came out pretty recently. This one academic paper by philosophers, ChatGPT is bullshit, is certainly worth a read. It really takes this philosophical point of view in how scholars have literally defined bullshit in the past and takes ChatGPT examples and goes through the process to essentially highlight that ChatGPT is not really doing anything that isn't more than bullshit. So it's worth a read if you're interested in sort of looking at it more from just a philosophical point of view. There's also this article that just came out this month that is from Australia, but they basically found that AI was worse than humans in every way of summarizing information. And so I think it just puts out that fundamental premise of yes, it can produce reports, summarize text, and draft content, but it's also important to think about the quality of what's actually being output. Just because it can do it doesn't mean it's doing it well necessarily. And I think these two examples from this academic paper and this recent news story just highlights that. I think it's always worth asking yourself that question. So these were the ethical concerns that I sort of outlined in the letter to the editor. The first one is the environmental impact. While there's a few specific numbers here that I'll highlight, this is definitely like a much broader issue than just what's reported here. The main crux behind the environmental impact is because of the large amount of computing power that it takes to run these models when you input prompts and the computers have to do the work to generate that output. It's essentially a race to build servers and server farms as fast as they can. And what happens with those buildings and servers that have to be built, there's of course all the infrastructure that has to happen. But one of the main things too is the amount of energy that's being used to run those servers, and then also the amount of energy that it takes to cool off those systems because of the amount of heat that they generate just from the sheer vast number of them that have to run to power ChatGPT specifically. So a couple examples here. Microsoft disclosed a 34% increase in its global water consumption from 2021 to 2022. and it was at least due in part to the partnership with OpenAI to support the development of ChatGPT. And a third of Microsoft global water consumption, you have to imagine that's not just, no pun intended, a drop in the bucket. That's quite a bit of water that's being used that wasn't before. The other one I think is really interesting is just this idea that one ChatGPT conversation. So I don't know what the average number of back and forth prompts is. I think in this article it cites maybe 5 to 7 back and forths. It takes about 16 ounces of water to cool the system that it takes to generate that one conversation between it. And so you can imagine with 150, 180 billion or million users, and how often that's being used, it's quite a lot on the environmental impact. And this is also, I would say, just the start of it, in terms of, ChatGPT is one large language model from one AI company. There's several out there. So it's a bigger problem than just ChatGPT. One of the headlines I thought was interesting that was also just recently, this past week, was just this idea that AI was predicted to consume twice as much as energy as the whole of France by 2030. So in 6 years, which again, it seems exponential, the amount of environmental impacts that are going to have from this technology. Exploitative labor practices. This is ethical concern number 2. So specifically with ChatGPT, they were paying workers in Kenya less than $2 an hour to essentially serve as moderators of content that in text that was being inputted to ChatGPT, as well as when offensive things were being generated in terms of output. They were sort of the people who were in real time sort of flagging it for content that they didn't want to have in the model anymore and didn't want it to output these offensive things. And so it's really the things that they were moderating out is really graphic things like murder and torture, self-harm, all kinds of things. And there's obviously some reporting about the downstream mental health effects that this had on their workers, all at these very low wages that this whole sort of enterprise was built on initially. So that's just one example. I'm not an expert in any of this by any means. I'd be shocked if this wasn't if this was the only example, but I think it's quite a striking one as well. It's also interesting, just from this article specifically, which I can't quite remember where this came from. I thought I had the title on it, but this image is also AI generated. And so we'll talk a little bit about some of the examples I have in. Essentially, there's programs out there, DALL-E is one, that do the same thing as LLMs, but for images and even music output now. So this image was AI generated by the outlet that wrote this article. And they even mentioned that typically they wouldn't do this, but they were doing it to because it went with the story, I guess. And I just thought it was interesting. It was an interesting choice to have this criticism about exploitative labor, and then even to highlight the image itself was AI generated just to make a point, which they didn't really actually make a point about it in the article itself. So we'll talk a little bit about images too throughout. So I wanted to just highlight that as an example. Okay, so the third one is bias. So there's been a lot of research out there about how ChatGPT output reflects the bias of the data it was trained on. And this often reflects stereotypes across society. And I'm guessing this will get better over time, just because they'll whether it's through workers to filter out differently or improve their models or whatever. I expect this will get better over time. But the idea, right, is that if they're just indiscriminately bringing in all text available on the internet as much as they can to inform their model, there's a lot of awful stuff out there. And you can think about, who is the dominant group in society, right? White, straight, male, gender, cis, all the things, able-bodied. And so, even just from the data that they're pulling in, it's not going to be representative, of course, in terms of viewpoints, comments. If you think of, Reddit, which is I don't know if you would describe it as a social media site necessarily. But I think of it, I don't know if they pulled YouTube comments specifically, but that's where my brain is going in terms of, if you can think of YouTube comments and the kinds of comments people leave on things, and if they're indiscriminately sort of bringing in all this text to just inform its model, you can imagine how some bias would slip into pretty easily the output. This has manifested also in when you ask ChatGPT for job recommendations for different demographics, it'll give you stereotypical answers. So a man, an engineer is an example, a woman, a teacher. So it kind of really stereotypes these job recommendations based on demographics. Not always, but there's lots of examples of that. And then this Rolling Stone article I thought was really, really valuable. This quote specifically was about how ChatGPT 2 was, it was about ChatGPT 2, the second version of it. But the quote is just that less than 15% of Wikipedia contributors were women or girls, only 34% of Twitter users were women, and 67% of Redditors were men. So again, just this idea that your model is only going to be as good as the data that it's being trained on. And as far as anyone can tell, besides these moderators, like I mentioned in the previous slide, they're sort of indiscriminately bringing in all of this and trying to deal with it after the fact about what it's actually saying or doing. Other examples that have come out in this article itself was about how AI is used or can be used for like housing applications and how it can discriminate against certain groups, in facial recognition about its ability to do so or not, and how it gets it wrong more often for certain groups than others. And so, those two examples aren't specific to ChatGPT, but still built on that general idea of how these platforms are built and trained and can be used. So the fourth specific ethical concern is about plagiarism. So ChatGPT is trained on everything that it can get its hands on, like I mentioned, and it doesn't usually have consent to do that from anyone. And so there's already ongoing lawsuits from the New York Times, fiction authors like John Grisham and George R.R. Martin, who has sued OpenAI for using their texts to train their models without permission. Specifically for the research audience, and in the paper, talk a little bit about APA defines plagiarism as the act of presenting words, ideas, images, or another as your own. It denies authors or creators of content the credit they are due, whether deliberate or unintentional. Plagiarism violates ethical standards in scholarship. And I think this is like the one sticking point that I haven't been able to figure out an other side argument for yet, because you can often cite ChatGPT in your paper, as in you have a sentence and you cite ChatGPT. Many places are sort of allowing that, but you have no ability to actually give credit to where those ideas and thoughts came from. It is a faceless program that is taking from lots of different people to combine and figure out and produce an output. And so to me, especially for scientific publishing, really narrowing in on it, I don't see how you can use ChatGPT, even with citing it, and how it doesn't violate plagiarism as far as APA definition goes. So that might be a good discussion point for later, but that's an important one. I mean, they're all important, but specific to this audience. So ethical concern number 5 is about authorship. So general consensus is that ChatGPT cannot be a co-author on scholarly work. So again, it kind of gets to that idea about who you're crediting and where this information is coming from. And this is pretty widespread, I would say. And the idea is that ChatGPT cannot meet the criteria for authorship in terms of accepting responsibility for the accuracy, integrity, and originality of the work. So it's always interesting that places have decided that you can cite ChatGPT, but that it can't meet this, this version of authorship in terms of accepting responsibility for these things. Obviously, you as the author do that, but I just think it's a interesting point to consider that you can't really use them as a co-author. And for me, I think this authorship plagiarism issue is really closely related because at its core, you simply cannot give credit to others for their contributions in your work. The last one is reference accuracy. So this is probably more minor than others. But essentially, if you ask ChatGPT to summarize things with citations, it's rather ineffective at giving you, it routinely gives you incomplete, incorrect, or altogether fictitious references to support its statements. And so, for me, with really about this and sort of any output related to ChatGPT generally, we know that it's not right 100% of the time. And so my own view is sort of like, well, if you have to double check everything that it says anyway, I'm just really not entirely sure how useful it would be. And references are just another example of that, of it might give you some, but no matter what, you're going to have to go find those original sources and ensure that what ChatGPT output interpreted those articles correctly. And it feels like a lot of work to sort of fact check yourself when you could just sort of do it yourself and along the way. So that comes to sort of my personal experience and how I became interested in this topic enough to write a letter to the editor. So I do some honors college teaching here at OSU, and it started with a toy-based technology for children with disabilities class, where we would learn the science behind early mobility experiences for children with disabilities. And then we'd go to the lab and modify ride-on cars as mobility devices for local families. And this was perfectly suited for the Honors College. These classes are capped at 14 students. These are seminar classes for them. So they're 2 credits. They can be taken by any year, any major. And so that was my entry into Honors College teaching. And after I taught that class for sometimes 2-3 times a year for 6-7 years, and I was talking to the associate dean of the Honors College right before I went out on paternity leave 3 years ago. And, she just mentioned, yeah, if you think of anything else to teach, just let me know. Your class has always gone well. Just, if you think of anything, just run it by me. So I started to teach Punk 101 that following year, and it's a great class. We listen to Punk. We talk about it. They write zines, which are low-cost, do-it-yourself pamphlet-style publications that they have as a final project. And so that went well. And so then I thought, well, what else can I get away with? And I really wasn't intending, well, I wanted to do it, but I didn't think I'd get a yes. But I started to, around the time proposals were due for new courses, I started to read a lot more independent horror. And I specifically got into body horror, which is a subgenre of horror, which is focused on the destruction, transformation, mutation, invasion of the human body in some way, shape, or form. And there's a lot in the indie horror scene for sure. There's a lot of queer authors that are writing about body horror. You can imagine with body dysmorphia and their own marginalized experiences. This is a really powerful subgenre of horror to tell their own stories. And I was gravitating towards reading some of that as well. And so I just sent an email to the associate dean, and I had written up a course description, and it involved body horror and focusing on queer authors and writing their own short fiction. And I had never written anything creative before this. So I just kind of sent it off thinking, okay, this will be okay, you've pushed a little too far. Maybe let's hold off on this one. But she replied back. She was like, yeah, this sounds great. You should do it. So I continued to develop it, and they let me teach it for the first time last year. And so the Swifties Unite class that you see on there, that's another Taylor Swift class I'm teaching in spring, not related to today, but just kind of the breadth of my honors college teaching. So what happened was I started to teach, I was about to teach the body horror class in the upcoming year, and I thought, I have no idea what I'm doing. I haven't written creatively before. I had just sort of kind of connected with a couple of people in indie horror. And so I kind of outsourced a few things, and I commissioned a couple of essays from people to write sort of unique essays for the students in the class about an introduction to body horror. And I hired an editor who writes horror to provide feedback to the students on their rough drafts and final drafts. And then I started writing myself, which has been super fun. And sort of over the last year and a half, I've had a couple of stories come out in a few online magazines. This was Mouthfeel Fiction, Divinations Magazine. I have got a story in there called Mood Belt, their disco themed horror issue. Underbelly Press, a very short 159-word story. Wall Street, which is coming out soon, and then a story in Punk Noir, the online magazine. And then self-publishing a novelette called The Night Demon in the next month or so. So all of this background is a personal experience I was gaining between reading independent horror, connecting with folks in independent horror, and starting to write and get more involved in who gets published and how to publish. And it's a whole different world, this idea of creative writing. It's been really interesting taking experience from scientific writing and trying to translate it and seeing sort of what's different and what's not different. So all of that backstory is to say that the single most fundamental thing that I've learned from independent horror is that there is a zero tolerance and a zero acceptability of use of AI in creative writing from the people in the presses that I sort of interact with. Tenebris Press is a indie horror press. They brand themselves as New Weird Horror. They're based in Portland, so right up the road from me. And to my knowledge and sort of what people seem to think is that they were the first ones that put a no AI clause in their author and illustrator contracts. And they edited this magazine that they put out called Thank You for Joining the Algorithm, which raised money for independent artists and illustrators as a sort of stance against AI. And this quote is from that issue in sort of the opening letter to the editor. And it says, "We're under attack. AI is threatening the livelihoods of writers, artists, and creative workers of all kinds. Generative AI programs such as ChatGPT and DALL-E are a pale imitation of the AI that classic science fiction stories warned us about, but their irresponsible development and exploitive use remain a cause for concern." And so, I think it's important to highlight this because just to say that not all industries are readily accepting of ChatGPT and generative AI, it's very much thought of in the creative writing world that I sort of spend some time in that it's idea theft. Like that's pretty much all it is. And use of AI in the communities that I'm involved in, if you do it, you will often get banned from ever submitting to them again. So it's a pretty hard line in terms of this idea of zero tolerance. Myself included, like many writers just will not submit to presses that allow AI use just because they don't want to be associated with it. And I do think it's kind of been interesting because it's sort of got me thinking about, even from scientific journals, about how a journal's policy about AI might influence my decision to submit our work to certain places, and whether I choose to cite works that disclose AI use in their papers. I don't think we're quite there yet, but I think it's something that I'm definitely thinking about, and I think it's something to think about. So a few myths before final thoughts. I'll kind of try to breeze through these a bit. The first one is simply that AI is here, so we must adapt and use it. I don't know where this one comes from, but I hear it, I feel like, all the time. There is a question about how long it will be here. The financials are pretty bleak on it. A recent report indicated that like OpenAI has burned through 8.5 billion on training and staffing and could lose 5 billion in this year alone. Now, those are just numbers. Startups lose money all the time. Some companies are never profitable, but still manage to stay on with investment capital and all kinds of things. So those are big numbers, but I think the highlight here is that they're not making money yet, and they're losing a lot of money from how expensive it is. So I'm just not convinced that in 5 years this is going to be a tool that just everyone uses all the time. And so I'm hesitant to invest a lot of time and energy, well, for many reasons, but one is I just don't know if it's going to stick around or not. It's been uh, kind of shocking how quickly it's kind of taken over. I think even at, like, our institution, um, the bottom text here in orange and white, this was from a handout like last spring that we got passed around to faculty about approaching students regarding AI use. The first one was acknowledging the power and usefulness of generative AI tools, and just you'll you might lose trust and credibility with your students if you don't acknowledge this. And I just, it kind of blew me away. I was kind of shocked about it, honestly. Just seemed, university committees take 3 years to decide on a room to hold a meeting, let alone we already have this very pro position on it. It was also during an AI week that was sponsored here, that was sponsored specifically by Microsoft, which uh, is just an interesting, I think it's important to think about, um, have a real conversation about where funding is coming from for these different things and who is funding what and why certain ideas might be getting pushed. It's not conspiratorial or anything like that. I'm just saying literally that Microsoft sponsored the event, and it's something to think about where and why these things are getting put in front of us so quickly. The other thing here was National Novel Writing Month faces backlash over AI issues. If you're not familiar, this is an organization based around really supporting writers in different ways for the month of November to try to push and write a whole novel. Really, they provide support in like community and connection and word counts and different tools to help you visualize your writing and that kind of thing. But their new policy was a very pro AI stance. And then, of course, it comes out that they're getting funded from AI companies to incorporate or at least be open to the technology. Number two, AI will take care of mundane writing tasks to free up your time for deep work. And I just don't think that's how capitalism works. I don't think that AI is going to be some magical solution that all of a sudden frees up our time to do other things. I think we'll be asked to do more things if it actually does what it says it can do. And I don't think we're really the real target user as like an individual person. I don't think there's any way a individual subscriber model to ChatGPT will ever let it turn a profit. They really have large contracts to implement AI in larger systems like our phones and computers and our email. And, that's where I think a lot of those contracts and profits are coming from. So I don't think it's really designed for like me to save me time, really. This just came out, I think, a day or two ago, that Lionsgate inked a deal with AI firm to mine its massive film and TV library. And the key part of this quote that's in this headline is it's going to use their TV library as the entertainment company uses the tech to develop cutting edge capital efficient content creation opportunities. So I read that as saving money, right? Like they're going to try to create new things off of all of this stuff that has been previously done without giving those people who did that original work any compensation or anything. Third one is that use of AI will better serve English as second language writers. I don't think there's any research on that. I think this is from talking to a few ESL writers that I have connected with. But just the idea of the process of learning to edit is critical to understanding a native level understanding of a language. And so whether it's, these automatic services to improve your English skills, I don't think is really a thing, right? The document may read better after using this tool like this, but the person is not necessarily going to learn any skills. And it depends on what your goal is for writing, right? But I think in some of the people that I've even talked to, some people find even this idea kind of offensive in general, that ESL writers are incompetent, that they need ChatGPT to write better English for them, and that they can't learn and get better on their own. There's also plenty of other tools out there that don't rely on AI for grammar and writing skills that aren't based on some of the concerns we've talked about today. So not suggesting that ESL writers don't have anything available, but it's really specific to this generative AI about, and the pitfalls with its use. And then the last point here is just that maybe journals should be more open to less than perfect English and rely more on copy editors in the publication process if this is a priority. I think we've done this at JMLD as far as I know and have been instructed, where, the writing in terms of English is not a criteria for rejecting a paper, right? You can certainly point out places where the writing could be strengthened, but it's not going to be a reject for that reason alone. And I think that's really good, because I'm not sure all journals necessarily do that when they're reviewing. So I think there's some work to be done on that one. Number 4, that if you're against AI, that you're being classist or ableist in some way. And so, this also brings up this idea of access and who has access to ChatGPT. There is a free model. There's also a subscriber model right now. What happens to these tools over time, and do they cost money, and who has access to it? So just not exactly buying that classist argument. Also, if you link it back to environmental impacts, we know that those impacts are going to have the greatest effect on vulnerable populations. So just another way that I think it's an anti-AA position is not classist. Same with ableist. It's much like the ESL conversation. Many disabled writers consider it offensive to suggest that they cannot come up with creative ideas on their own, that ChatGPT somehow levels the playing field, where that really diminishes disabled writers' own ability to create on their own, which they are capable of doing. So often you'll hear that it's ableist if you have an anti-AA position. And then the last myth here is that the good will outweigh the bad. So, this is like from the last, not very long. Well, one is from last year, but so someone was arrested recently for creating fake bands with AI and then made 10 million off listening to their songs with bots in, I think it was Spotify. There's also the use of AI to create deepfakes, which a deepfake is just video, sound, or image of a real person that's been digitally altered or manipulated, often through AI to misrepresent them. An example of this was I think it was the primaries, but in New Hampshire, there was a robocall going out of President Biden's voice telling voters not to vote, to save it for November, even though, it was a deep fake. Obviously, it wasn't him. So this has obviously real implications on people. The last one is a Taylor Swift example. The image on the left was AI generated, and obviously she came out and after the debate, announced her support for Vice President Harris and Waltz, and just again highlighting that Donald Trump retweeted or retruthed or whatever it is, whatever platform currently on, that AI generated image of Taylor Swift, and just how deceiving and deception that can be for people if they don't know what they're seeing, right? Okay, so just a couple of final thoughts. Academic publishing and AI contracts. This is a major one, especially for this audience, obviously. So Wiley and Taylor and Francis recently announced partnerships that will give tech companies access to academic content to train their AI models. And I think for a long time, we as researchers have been fine with the status quo of, you might spend thousands of research dollars in funding, anywhere from 100 to 500 hours to complete a research project, write it up, submit it to a journal that relies on peer reviewers who don't get paid, associate editors who don't get paid, editors who might get a small stipend, which are then published by obviously these publishing companies, who then charge lots of money for access to those academic articles. And that was sort of one layer of bad that we've all sort of accepted over the years, because we need them as academics for all the reasons that you already know about. But this feels like one further step that feels less okay, and I feel like we're getting double I don't know what the word is, but sort of double gotten here, in terms of now all of that information that we've now published, now Wiley and Taylor and Francis are now making more money off of it to sell it to AI companies so they can make money off of it. And it just feels like this weird feedback loop that we're getting, everyone who's doing the work is getting left out of that equation. I've put it on at least our faculty meeting upcoming this year to talk about what to do about AI and our graduate student policy handbook. I'd like to have a policy about not allowing its use, at least for the milestones that come with a PhD program, like candidacy exams and dissertation. It'll be interesting to see where that goes. And then for JMLD, this isn't something I've spoken specifically to Martin, the editor-in-chief, yet, or anything like that, and I doubt it'll happen, but just my own personal perspective, I would love if we were the first journal to say, you just can't do it. For all of these reasons, with a strong rationale, we're just not going to allow it. So just my last thought is that I'm not specifically scared of AI, like I think is often portrayed in the media. I just sort of think it's a waste of time and money on a product that seems mostly useless and that actively hurts the environment and marginalized groups. And I think it's at least worth that conversation, because I don't think you see a lot of criticism of AI out in the open yet in terms of academic institutions. Okay, so that is everything I have, and I think we have a few minutes for sure for discussion.
Why don't you unshare your screen so we can?
Yeah.
And then if people have questions, if you could put them in the chat box, that would be great. Oh, Haley already. She's on it. Haley, I'll let you speak to that. Okay.
Sorry. Happy to speak. Hey, Sam, thank you for this talk.
Yeah.
It's a lot of really good food for thought. I'm sorry to not have my camera on. I'm picking up my small person from school. So I am here with you 100% intellectually, but just not visibly. So my question is maybe two completely separate questions, and you can tackle them as you like. The first is, I work within the neurodivergent and disabled community. Lots of folks within that community have affirmed that they find some AI tools like Goblin tools really useful for helping them to organize tasks, do time management, break down things that would otherwise, particularly like for somebody with executive dysfunction, be a difficult thing to do. I myself, as a person with a history of concussions, find tools like that really useful where my frontal lobe falls short. So I guess I wonder whether you think that there is a case for AI for good. Do those tools exist? Do you think it's possible? Are these critiques sort of specific to ChatGPT, or have you thought about the greater AI landscape as it relates to accessibility and accommodation? The second question, which is totally separate, is, in your proposal that JMLD adopt an anti-AI policy, how would you envision detection of that, or monitoring and policing of such a policy, given that it's so difficult to tell, other than like a vibe check, right? We get a gut feeling. So difficult to tell what was or was not generated by AI. So you're welcome to tackle either of those, neither of those, whatever strikes your fancy.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you. Yeah, so your first question, yes. So yes to all of it. And what I mean by that is a lot of my critiques were specifically to ChatGPT, and when these tools are created unethically through not gaining consent from people to develop them and everything else that came with it. So I don't know the specific tools that you had mentioned, but yes, absolutely. I think even a version of ChatGPT where you get consent for the data that you're using to train the model and do it in a way in which is, in my view, sort of ethically sourced and from the get-go. Like, yes to everything you said, basically, is my very short answer on that. And that's where, AI is such a broad term, and it can be used in, all these different ways to describe different things. So yeah, a lot of these criticisms were very specific to ChatGPT or like DALL-E, the image creator. Anytime when they're just taking data that they didn't ask for to create it and not have any, sort of care or regard in the process, I think that's a real problem. I think that's where the potential, I think, really is for AI. Like you had mentioned, these cases of like Goblin tools, like you mentioned, any of those things that can be helpful. And that's why I sort of think that they I hope that companies actually design tools ethically and for those intended purposes, because I do think that they would be extremely beneficial and helpful and everything for accessibility and accommodation. So yeah, so that's the first part. I mean, I think
that's really fair. I want to respond to that because I agree with you, and I think that's really fair. And I think that's where community engaged research is crucial, because if you're designing tools with representation from the folks that you intend for the tools to help, hopefully it helps with these issues, right? Like, hopefully folks say, this is what we need for it to do, and you design it for that purpose. And then those folks would also say, here's what we're concerned about, and help you to build the guardrails so that you don't accidentally develop a tool that's used for a nefarious purpose, or where, bias is unaccounted for and might cause larger disparities or problems in the long run. So I totally agree with you there.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. I mean, yes. I mean, and honestly, right, like community participatory research, like if that model could be implemented, like you mentioned, in the development, design, creation, implementation of these tools, that's going to be where it's at. I hope that happens. Yeah.
But unlike the tool Turnitin, there isn't any tool that would allow JMLD or a faculty member, the student in a class, to detect whether something had been generated by some of these AI tools.
Yeah, no, that's right. And I think it is more of it might be more of a philosophical position than it is an enforceable position. It's just like my classes, I have on my syllabus a no AI statement, and it'll take a lot to sort of suss that out. And a lot of it will be based on, just like now too, in some ways, in terms of any sort of plagiarism it's, unless you can find large chunks of text that are word for word and go looking for it, we don't, now any articles that come in, manuscripts that come in, we don't check for plagiarism, except for if we were the author of something that was copied and pasted, and we might know it. But so yeah, I think that probably is an impossible task. With the image stuff, you can often, there's now tools out there that are actually pretty good about detecting whether an image was AI generated or not, but much harder for text. Yeah.
So let me ask this to the people who are now teaching. I had read an article in the Chronicle that people were telling students to use ChatGPT for one version then submit that version and then how they modified that version. Is that how people are? I mean, I think it was, I don't know who Paul Merca is, but said, it's almost, detection is almost impossible. And that's, so why not like, okay, accept it. And then, kind of see how you would modify it or how you would use that first version. And with full disclosure, David and Haley and I created the title of our session that we did on journal editing, the good, the bad, and the ugly, by putting into ChatGPT, give us a title and then say sassy title or something like this. So it was generative. It doesn't mean that you use the final version, but it helps you, especially us old people or creative people, to kind of come up with something, especially when you get sassier, kind of thing.
Yeah.
What do you think? How do you think we should handle this? Not just in journal writing, but also in our teaching, or as you said, comprehensive exams that are done in a room where you're just using a computer.
Yeah, and that's sort of part of Kara's question there too. Yeah, I've even had instructors say that they assign for students specifically to write a paper with ChatGPT, and then the assignment is to critique that paper. But then I had that same instructor turn around and say, but the smart ones just turn their ChatGPT paper into a different one and ask for a critique on it, and then they get a critique from a different one. And so for me, it's just I'm just like, I don't. It kind of makes my head want to explode, if I'm being honest. And I think of like I'm just not there yet in terms of that. I think that I even have a responsibility to teach students how to use AI. Like, we're like a minute into this, and I don't think it's my responsibility, is like the really harsh version, I guess, to figure out a way to implement this in my class. Like I just, it's this idea of like, it's here, so you have to use it and figure it out now. And I'm just like, not, I guess, I don't know if I'll get there, but that's one of the points I didn't say on one of my slides. But this idea of academic freedom and this idea of it's here, so you better adapt and use it. And like, as far as I can tell so far, I don't think anyone's gonna make me use this in any way if I choose not to. And so I think that's just a good, like, hopefully, like, putting that seed out there. I'm not, saying what you should or shouldn't do, but just this idea that just because it's here doesn't mean you have to use it in every way imaginable yet or ever.
Other questions? I don't see another one in the chat box here. Do we have another one?
Can I ask one more if there's not anything else in the chat? Because this is a particular area of interest for me. So Sam, this is Haley again.
Yeah.
So I think, as a faculty member, we know that we are increasingly asked to do administrative tasks that have very little to do with science or pedagogy, right? We're asked to do things like reformat our CV into a slightly different structure, or change the way that we present this information from our annual review to our third-year review. There is a mental and physical health cost to humans of all of that additional busy work. And I hear you in your statement of like, that's not how capitalism works. If we save time here, somebody else is going to steal it from us. I agree with you. But I do wonder if there's an argument to be made for like the short-term well-being gains of being able to outsource some of that type of stuff. Even as simple as like a student of mine who's in the lab who's watching on Zoom, and I have used ChatGPT to translate a search strategy that we built originally from scratch in Medline, and we just needed a Scopus version and a PsycInfo version, and that's all we had to do, right? So we could have looked up all that syntax and taken the time to troubleshoot it and all that, but it took us just a couple minutes to plop it into ChatGPT and then double check it and make sure it was working correctly. So I wonder if there's this ethics trade-off of like, is the human gain to time and stress and mental health, at least in the short term, enough of a counterpoint to balance out some of the other concerns, or do you feel like it's not quite enough to make it worthwhile?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And obviously I think that's sort of like every person has to sort of make that decision on their own. And I think it does feel like for those things where it actually works that seamlessly, that feels like in a vacuum, yeah, like it would almost seem silly not to use it for, like you said, the translation from one format to another, or yeah, CV translation from one format to another, any of those kinds of things. Because that also doesn't really, that's also really not content generation, right? Like it's doing a different thing than creating new content or new paragraphs of writing based on a prompt that you answered.
Exactly.
So I do think there's, many different ways that it could be used that doesn't always hit on some of the criticisms I had today, for sure. Yeah.
I think it's a valid point thinking about the energy consumption ethics of it too, though. And what is all that going to cost in the long run if we're all doing that all day, every day? I don't mean to push back against some of those other counterpoints of yours, because I think they're good points. What I grapple with right now is like, how can I do enough time saving to have space and energy for human relationships? And where are the ways that I can sort of optimize the little bitty work throughout the day that takes up a tremendous amount of time and effort, but maybe would be faster if I could figure out an algorithmic way around it.
Yeah, absolutely. My biggest struggle was from the disabled perspective and ESL perspective of that's so challenging, because I recognize how, I recognize how it could be used and be helpful in different ways. And so
okay, we have another question from Elena. I don't want to lose that question, Tom. Elena?
Actually, thank you. It's not really a question, it's just a comment on the conversation. I actually had at some point a student that provided me with the first draft of a manuscript, and there were actually paragraphs written in ChatGPT. So I was actually able to see it, because there were, certain ways of constructing the sentences. And then when I asked the student, did you use, and then, yeah, and I'm okay, but how did you use it? And they said, they told us that we're able to use it on the seminar. And the problem is, yes, you're allowed to use it, but are you really trained on how to use it? And I actually have heard even faculty from computer science engineering, they actually instruct their students to construct the introduction from ChatGPT. So, okay, I understand for some areas that may be fine, but creating a protocol for a human subject study based on an introduction or a literature review that has been constructed from ChatGPT, I would be really worried about that. So I completely agree with you, Sam. If they are maybe just slightly changing, I understand. I really agree about the English part, because I'm also not a native speaker. So yes, if they're doing the job for me, I'm not going to learn, right? On the other hand, I understand Haley, because yes, it's a time of matter these days. We have to publish, have to do all these things fast. But I'm just wondering how can we protect the new generation? Because our generations have lived without ChatGPT, so we're kind of able to see how to correct or check things. But the new generations that will learn just using ChatGPT, how are they going to even check if ChatGPT is right? Or even if they are going to take the time to do it?
Yeah, I think it is such a big shift, because Jane and I were talking in our pre-meeting earlier this week of just, how my advisors, not Leah, but Mark Fishman, would have to still, mail out manuscripts for review. But just this idea that like, there really hasn't been a shift in how manuscripts are written and reviewed in, email is a different mode of delivery, but not fundamentally change the way it's done. And this certainly, like access to ChatGPT, certainly feels like a fundamental shift, that newer students have access to something that is extremely different to the way anything's ever been done before. So I do think that there's going to be a major gap between students and faculty until these students become faculty, and then if it's stayed on the same path, then it'll look different then. And we'll all be retired anyway, but
on that same note, although, to make the point about what those students do with it, we had a job description for this support group, and it was for grad students. And most of the grad students who are applying were coming from, they were second language, and they were also coming from the computer tech area. And so what they must have done was all feed into the ChatGPT, the job description, because every letter, yeah, there was some tweaks here and there, but they all started by, this sounds like such a very interesting job, blah, blah, blah. We had 50 applicants, and I would say 30 of them almost looked identical, and they obviously had used this. Now, to sort of Haley's point, well, that's an efficiency. Why bother spending a lot of time writing a letter, especially when you just want to get in the door to get an interview? But it was still, it just kind of blew my mind. But on the other hand, I still think about the days when I was a child and you wanted to look something up and you had to go to the Compton's Encyclopedia, and now you can just Google it. So I think we need to figure out how to use this, not to push against it, but to say, how will it help us, and not just say, oh no, it'll put our heads in the sand and say, no, this is never going to happen. Now, I'm not in the real world like you guys are, but in the same way, but I still think, full disclosure, my cats wrote my Christmas letter, and their first wish to Santa Claus, coming from ChatGPT, was more lap time, less laptop time. So that's from their mothers. So it was like, I would never have thought that up, but ChatGPT gave it to me because I wrote in the word sassier or, something else. I just kept saying, my cats are writing my Christmas letter. Here's what I want. And I can tell you, I didn't use much of it. And I did make an attribution in the letter saying that this came from ChatGPT because I could never be this clever. So anyhow.
Jane, I think you raise an interesting point about Google, though, because Google isn't magic. Google is an algorithm, too. And Google prioritizes the things that the Google folks thought we should see first when we search for things. So although this feels like a massive paradigm shift, this is just really the next step after Googling in a lot of ways, because we're already getting pushed results that are specific to our patterns of browsing behavior. Even those of us who think we're evading it all by using an incognito browser are still getting things pushed to us by our patterns of mobile phone behavior and our geography and our GPS and all that. So I think, there's a point at which it does feel new, but it is not too much of a massive leap from what we were already experiencing with the sophistication of search engines that were out there to begin with. So that's where I feel like our responsibility is to teach students where these tools come from, what their biases are, what their drawbacks are. And Sam, that's why we were excited about your paper for Journal Club, because I think it's good to have that open dialogue about what the real limitations of this are and what the real pitfalls are, so that we are able to make an informed choice about whether and how to use them.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, and I think so. Oh yeah, go ahead.
I'm going to use that as a wonderful closing statement. And I'm going to thank Sam for doing this, because I think it was obviously there's lots of things that it generates. It's generative. And it's my role to tell us all this is being recorded, and it will be kept on the website along with all the other IMDRC journal clubs. If you're a member of IMDRC, which does not cost very much to belong, is that you can access those and use them for your class again. So they're always available. I also want to remind you that our next IMDRC Journal Club is October 17th, same time, same station. There'll be a link to that. It's already on the website. This one's an interesting one because I used to always think about sensitive versus critical periods. There's no such thing as a critical period in us the same way. So this is sensitive periods in male adolescent basketball players. Now that's an interesting one. So I'll just point you to the IMDRC, i-drc.com website for more information. And again, thank you, Sam. Thank you very much. A very nice job.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for the great discussion, too. And always happy to chat more.
Yeah, you can always follow up with him. So I'm going to stop our